before we're actually going to take questions, we're going to play a game. That's right, a game with a kind of serious intent. It's called Some Questionable News. Now, the subject of stress and what can be done about it is as susceptible as to misinformation as any other subject in science these days. So what we're going to do is we're going to present headlines, 4 of them. They may have actually appeared in the media somewhere, or they may have been just created by the Royal Canadian Institute staff. And our question is not, do you agree with the headline or not? No, it's not that. It's, do you think this was an actual real headline, or do you think that we just made this up? So, clear, everybody? All right, let's have the first headline, and I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Demi Moore's missing teeth. Can stress really make teeth fall out? Now, I'm not asking you if that's true. I'm asking you, was this a real headline or was this made up? Panel, what do you think?
I'm going to say the National Enquirer would probably write something like this.
Yeah, so you think it actually appeared somewhere? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree too. Yeah.
Sonia?
I'm pretty sure.
It was real? Let's have a look. Yeah, it was. And it was on Live Science, which, I look at regularly, so may have to. We won't even get into whether that's actually possible. Okay, second headline. Ice cream, everyone's cure for stress. Well, Dr. Fiocco did talk about diet. Was this a real headline?
If it wasn't, it should have been.
Okay.
I'm going to say yes.
Yeah. Are you saying yes, Jaideep?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. They all go for it's a real headline. And look, there it was in the science. Boy, I'll tell you, these are pretty highfalutin places that we've seen these headlines at. Okay, next one. Panel's right so far. Don't think about it too much. Feeling good in quarantimes. Gee, I wish I'd thought of that word. Okay, real? Made up?
Perhaps it's my French, but I have problem understanding the semantic of this title, but sure, why not?
Yeah, real? Yeah.
I'm going to say no. I don't think it's catchy enough.
Yeah, I'm going to go with made up as well.
Oh, okay, you mean you're judging it on style points? Okay.
Everything is possible,
Oh, these people are just too smart. Okay, and our last headline. Dark chocolate eliminates symptoms of anxiety and depression. New research.
I'm going to say true.
True.
I'm teaching a class Tuesday on scientific journalism and these types of titles, and I'm pretty sure it's true.
Okay, let's have a look. Yeah, okay, so the panel, wow, this has been excellent. I don't know how you at home have done, but it would be hard to better the panel.
Can I just say something about that, Jay?
Sure.
The word eliminates. And I just want to give an advice to the public. Many, many times when I give a public conference, people come to see me and say, listen, I've read somewhere that they found, the cure for depression and it's whatever, drinking grapefruit juice or something like that. And it says that, it's cured, it eliminates, etc. And the answer I always have is the following. I say to the person, that every scientist in the world wants to have the Nobel Prize, right? Yeah. Then, do you think that if it was really true that someone could eliminate depression, that they would not have won the Nobel Prize by now? You see, so it doesn't make sense sometimes when you have these, extraordinary claims like this that, no one picked it up beside the journalist.
Well, and let's not forget that whoever wrote that article in most cases, doesn't write the headline. And the headline writer is simply trying to draw eyes to the article. So the article might have said, for some people at some points, stress might be slightly reduced. And, that just becomes eliminate when you're under a lot of time pressure, which,
Yeah.
of course, is stress for the headline writer. Actually, to start the question period, Sonia, when you said it's not the combination of time and pressure, because both young and old suffer from stress. But then when I when I listened to you describe the characteristics, something novel, something unpredictable, a threat to your ego, and a sense of no control. As someone who's had a freelance career, and you suddenly find yourself with way too many assignments that you kind of wanted, but you didn't want them at the same time. They meet all those characteristics. It's new. I didn't know this was going to happen. My reputation will be shot because I'll do a terrible job on these things. I have no control. So it's no wonder that time and pressure are seen as being linked to stress. So even though it doesn't apply across the age span, is it true that time and pressure are one of the significant causes, that combination of stress?
The thing is that what we have found in our studies is that the definition that people have of stress will determine what they figure out is stressful for them and the way they will deal with it. So when everyone thinks that stress is time pressure, many people will say, no, it's time pressure. They have a lot of problems understanding that, someone threatening your ego at the coffee machine could explain, the headache you have later on and that you will attribute to something else. So it's quite important for them to understand that time pressure, as you said, is nothing else than someone losing control over time, the same way that this person can lose control over their health, their marriage, their finance, but it's a loss of control of time. But it's one aspect of the stress response, the same way that Alexandra was saying, coping, there are many, many ways. We found that it's quite important to say to people, there might be some spies out there that you don't know are stressing you because you're putting all your attention on time pressure and you're forgetting all the rest that could, lead to a stress response, and you don't see it under your radar. And yet it has some effects, as Jaideep was saying.
This might be a fault. Yeah, go
Can I
ahead.
add to that?
Please.
Sorry. Also, just recognizing that there are some people who love working under time pressure.
Yes.
So, stress is in the eye of the beholder. And so if someone is saying it's time pressure, well, it's important to get them to identify, well, what is it about time pressure? Is it threat to ego that if you don't meet this deadline, you'll be perceived poorly? Or so I think you really have to look at what is creating the stress or what's being perceived as stressful, and really look at those ingredients to be able to identify what is it.
Yeah.
I'd actually say that the absence of those kind of time pressures can also be stressful. If somebody feels they're most effective at working at a high level, suddenly when there's nothing to do.
Yes, if I can add something to this, and Alex knows about this, there's an inverted U shape between stress and performance and well-being. So a little bit of stress is good. It is necessary to increase your vigilance and give you, the energy you need to do something, get out of bed and work. And to a certain level of resistance that is very different from people to people, you're going to have the negative effects. So some people, some of my colleagues, and perhaps myself as well, are starting to realize that a lot of the low well-being we see, for example, in students is an under-stimulation. There's not enough stress anymore, because you have to understand that going to school and asking yourself whether she's going to talk to you or whether they will, these are good stress that are not there anymore because everyone is confined at home. So we may see now the effects of understimulation. So that's exactly why it is so important to separate all these characteristics.
Jaideep, you were going to comment?
Yeah, I was going to comment because one of the things I think that we're talking about around stress that Dr. Lupien and Dr. Fiocco raised is this idea of having control in stress. I think this is a really, really critical piece that we need to think about. So, for example, you mentioned that some people under time pressure actually do well, and that's because previously they've done really well, and so it's a situation over which they feel like they have a lot of control. Yes. And what a lot of work has shown, a lot of experiments have shown, is that being able to exert and know that you have control and learn to have control in one stressful situation actually transfers to other situations, even if they're completely unrelated situations. And so the sense, the perception of control is a really critical feature in how we manage and cope with stress.
Yeah.
You know, I know when I feel stressed, but I'm not sure I would know how any of you experience stress. And so is there a wide range of responses? And well, I'll ask that. It's a very bad habit to ask two questions at the same time. So I'm going to ask the one. Is there a wide range of responses to stress?
An amazingly wide range. You have physical signs. Some of them, for example, the pupils will dilate. So if you look, you're sitting at the dinner table, very fun to see this with children. I did that all my life with my children. So you're sitting at the dinner table and you know, your son is getting a stress response. You're not sure. Look at his eyes. The pupils will dilate. Why? In order to let more light into the eye. Why? So you can see in the dark. Why? In case your mammoth attack you at night, you're going to be able to kill it. It's a beautiful stress response. Your cardiac rhythm will increase to send more blood to your muscles so you can be very strong. You know, if you try to separate two children fighting at school, you're going to say, my God, they're so strong. They're not strong like this in normal life, but they are having a stress response. Another sign, you're going to have a digestion problem. Why? Because digesting takes a lot of energy. And it is as if the brain was saying, it's not time to digest. It's time to kill a mammoth. So all the energy you would take, I'm going to send it to your muscle so you can be very strong. So, and what you have to understand is that you have different signs in different people. And in one person, stress can come out one way on Monday and on another way on Wednesday. And just to finish, you have, because of the stress hormones acting on the brain, you have psychological signs. You're going to have a lot of rumination, and Alex knows a lot about that. Then your hamster will start to be hyperactive. And what is a hyperactive hamster? It's a brain that has detected a threat that you did not negotiate yet. And since the job of the brain is to help you survive, it is as if the brain was saying, you have to deal with this. You may have some memory problems, not because you're Alzheimer, but because the most important information for your brain is the threatening information, so you're not memorizing other stuff. And one of the signs, everyone knows about this because everyone got one since the beginning of this pandemic, you're going to have what is called, and I'm going to talk about that, you're going to have what is called spontaneous anger. You're going to get angry, and this is, one of the signs that has been studied in animal research by Mary Dahlman for many, many years. So these are some of the signs.
That's good. And there are follow-ups to this, but one of our questions from the audience is very directly connected to what you just said. So let me, even if you say roughly the same thing, let me forward this question. What about GI symptoms in children? For example, tummy aches about going to school. So you've already explained that that's a stress. How can it be reduced is the viewer's question.
I'm going to let Alex answer that because she's good at the way to decrease the stress response, and abdominal breathing would be one of them, but Alex can follow up on that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's just it. There's a lot of work being done in the field of mindfulness with children now. And one thing is that, it's great to learn strategies at any point in our lifetime, but of course, the earlier we learn how to regulate our attention, our behavior, and our emotions, the better for us throughout the lifespan. So there's a lot in terms of mindfulness and self-compassion training that's going on in children. And so as Sonia mentioned, belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing is very effective at reducing that stress response. It actually is it's antithetical to stress. So by engaging in deep diaphragmatic breathing, you're actually shutting down the sympathetic branch, and you are facilitating the parasympathetic branch. So these two nervous systems that are part of our autonomic nervous system that describes this physiological stress response that we engage in.
Not that I'm skeptical about that, but I could envision that being very difficult with a young kid who's nervous about going to school.
Yeah, but this is why doing it over and over again is important, right? It's not something that everyone gets right away. Like anything, if you want to become good at something, you have to train. Even a child has to train at piano or playing soccer or what have you to get good at it. So it's something that it's something that needs to be trained.
And if I may add something that we have started to study in the lab, to answer your question, we have to normalize the brain response, stress response. We're pathologizing everything these days. Being stressed for the first day at school, being stressed before an exam, it's not only normal. You want to have a stress response. The problem is that no one ever said that to these kids. So what it does, it creates what is called anxiety sensitivity. Now, what is anxiety sensitivity? It's the fear of being stressed out. So remember, I told you when you're stressed out, your body sends you some cues that you're having a stress response. You're sweating, etc. For some reason, some kids and some adults, when they receive this message, they freeze. They have a panic attack. And for many years, scientists didn't know why, and we're starting to understand. These kids are 14 years of age, let's say, or 8. Since they were born, each time they read the social media or anything, they read about the negative effects of stress. Stress will kill you. Stress is bad. And after this, we are surprised that a young child who's having a normal stress response before an exam totally freaks out. So I think that as a parent and as scientists and as journalists, it is our duty to normalize the stress response and say, no. This is normal. You're going to have stomach ache. It's normal. This is your brain getting prepared, for example, to go fight or whatever. And if we do this, you will decrease significantly these stress response. So we have to go on the positive sides.
Jaideep, I'd like to switch to you because there are a couple of questions related to your experiments, but could you just give us a more detailed picture of a typical experiment in your lab that leads you to the idea of stress being transmissible?
Sure. So as I indicated previously, we work with mice as kind of our model system to try to understand stress. Model systems are great for stress because stress has been conserved through evolution for hundreds of millions of years. And so the parts of the brain that are engaged by stress are pretty much the same actually in lower organisms and in people. So it makes for a great model system. And so the experiment that we do is we usually have 2 mice, and in our experiments they're the same sex and they're siblings, and so they've been together for all of their lives. We take one mouse out and we give it a stress, and so things that are stressful for mice are putting them in some water and making them swim for a few minutes. You can give them a shock to their foot. You can prevent them from moving, so you make them immobile. Then you bring the mouse back and allow it to interact with its sibling for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And and then we can measure hormones in these mice. We can, while they're interacting, we can look at their specific behaviors. And then we can look at what happens specifically at the areas of the brain that Dr. Lupien talked about that execute or initiate the stress response that are in the hypothalamus. And so what we found is that stress hormones go up obviously in the stress mouse. They also go up in the other mouse that interacts with it. The behaviors of the mice are really very different. The mouse that is not stressed spends a lot of time interacting, chasing, trying to engage the other mouse that has been stressed. And it's through this interaction that the unstressed mouse picks up this pheromone cue. And then the final thing to look at changes in brain function, what we've shown is that changes in the way cells in the brain talk to each other after stress are actually mirrored in the mice that were not stressed, but just interacted with the stressed mice.
So it's beneficial. It's not beneficial to the sibling that was never stressed because that mouse now becomes, or at least shows some of the stress changes.
I think again, we have to go back to this idea of what is beneficial, how we frame beneficial and not beneficial. Evolutionarily, it's beneficial because you're receiving information about a threat. without having experienced the threat. It's a huge benefit, right?
Yeah.
The dimensions of the information you get are limited. So you don't know that the threat was over here on the left, but you know generally there was a threat. So it's almost like an inoculation when we think about viruses, right? Like you have a little bit of information that says, something not very good happened. I may just need to lay low for a little while. So that's very helpful. Now, if it continues to happen over and over and over, that might not be beneficial. I mean, when we have behaviors like this and transmission of information that is preserved through species in evolution, that happens because there is decidedly a benefit for the organism. And so it took us a while to try to get our head around why would we be transmitting stress to others. And the reason it continues to exist is because that signal has some importance and conveys information that can be helpful.
What's the effect on the mouse that was originally stressed?
Yeah, so that depends on if it's a female or a male.
Yeah.
In males, the effect is negligible as far as we can tell. In females, it's really interesting. The effects of stress seem to almost reverse. So the effects of stress go down. Its cortisol or stress hormone levels decrease. Its changes in brain function go back to almost a normal state. And as you increase the number of partners that it goes back to from 1 to 2 to 3, then in females, you can't even detect that they were stressed. And so we actually don't know how this happens. We don't know the mechanism for the underlying biology behind it. But it's really just a really fascinating series of observations.
Okay, so I'm glad you answered those questions because we have some questions related to that. One is, does the sex specificity, got that right, mean that only females release stress pheromones? Do the pheromones have to do with other sex-related hormones?
No, both males and females release pheromones. As far as we can tell, they release them equally well. So that's not an issue. It doesn't seem to be related, that part anyway, to any sex hormones. The cells that control the release of pheromones in the brain are the same cells that Dr. Lupien talked about that initiate the response to stress. So it's this really concerted response to not only get your body to do the things it needs to do, but then to also broadcast the signal so that those who are close to you, very, very near to you physically, can start to detect that there's a threat.
And a skeptic would ask you, I'm not asking you this, a skeptic would ask you,
Yeah.
how safe it is to translate the results in mice to humans.
So work like this has been done in humans. So people have looked at the transmission of anxiety, for example, in students taking exams, right? And how that affects performance. And so I think that the results on things like this translate really well into humans.
Yeah,
I'm sure that Dr. Lupien has thought about this.
Yeah, no, but actually it's called stress resonance in humans. So German scientists have shown this. So let me explain. If I take a human being, I bring him to my lab and I stress this person and I measure the stress hormones, they will increase. That's normal. Now, I bring this person, this is the person, I stress this person and it increases the stress hormones. And then I bring another person and I say to this second person, you are not going to be stressed. You're safe. You are just going to observe this one being stressed. So you're the observer. And I measure the stress hormones in this observer and they will increase at the same time as the stressed out person. And what the German scientists have shown is that the closer the two people are, daughter, mother, and husband, wife, the more, it's called stress resonance, the more stress resonance we will have. So it's not this, we cannot get to the mechanism like Jaideep is doing in rats because, cannot open their brain. But basically, this has been shown over and over in humans as well.
Well, what's
Okay,
also been shown in terms of sex differences, it gets more complicated in humans because we also have gender differences, right? So we also have to consider that. And there is research to suggest that men benefit from social support from from their female. So all this research is done in heterosexual couples, but that men benefit more from social support from their partner than do females. And in some cases for females, it can actually enhance the stress response when their male partner is in a laboratory undergoing some sort of psychosocial stressor. So it is really complicated. It's extremely complicated. It gets more messy as we look at humans.
Yeah. Jay, if I may just take this advantage, because I'm a scientist having a question for Jaideep, and I would like to take the opportunity, because this is a question that the public always asks me, and I don't know the answer. So perhaps Jaideep, you will help me answer the public. The main question, and this is such a good question, people come in and said, okay, if I can resonate my stress, can I resonate my calmness? Can you take someone who is very calm and decrease the stress response of someone else? Do you have any data on that?
We don't have data. It's a question we've thought about a lot. Not just calmness, but happiness, the other side of a negative state, a positive state. So there's a little bit of data from an Italian lab that suggests that mice are very good at detecting both a negative state and a positive state in others. So they'll tend to, if you have a mouse that's a neutral mouse or a mouse that's they have this experimental way to make mice happier, that a mouse will actually go towards the happier mouse more than the neutral mouse. And a mouse will go to a negative or unhappy mouse more than a neutral mouse. And so the two sides of emotion are the ones that they are detecting. And, I was thinking about this just last night, because we can understand how negative states transmission of those might be beneficial, because it helps you avoid danger. And it's kind of hard to understand how positive states might help. But then I realized that one of the things I really missed in this pandemic is live sporting events. If you ever go to a live sporting event, the transmission of that positive state, it's contagious. You feel it. And so I wonder if the transmission of that will require greater numbers. It's a weak signal that's amplified by having many, many others in the same state. So that's something we think about. But the calm part is a very hard experiment for us to think about in terms of how would we do that experiment, right? But yeah, it's a terrific experiment.
Yes.
So I have a question here that I'm going to put out anyway, just so that the viewer gets it answered, but I think it's already been answered, but I'd still invite comments. From what I know, it's widely debated whether or not humans can actually detect pheromones. Has there been any new research that confirms that people can detect them subconsciously or not?
So there's a beautiful set of papers from an Israeli group looking at the transmission of signals associated with fear or threat versus, so what they did was they basically put towels under people's arms when they were skydiving, right? Or their t-shirts, and they kind of squeezed out the t-shirts, and then they did the same with people who just exercised. And the signatures of those are very different. People can detect the difference in smell. But what they find is that if they were to pipe those into a room through the ventilation at a level where people don't consciously perceive those signals, it still changes their arousal, their kind of sweatiness in their palms. It changes the variability of their heart rate. So I think that's pretty clear that we are able to detect. And when we think about the way the brain is organized, sensory inputs from the olfactory system, our nose, our eyes, there are direct inputs that go down to these stress areas that never get near the cortex, okay? And so it's very possible, I would say yes, that subconsciously we do perceive these signals without consciously being aware that we're perceiving the signals.
Okay, here's a change of pace. Can stress be transmitted through online interconnections?
Online stresses me out all the time.
I've seen one paper, again by the German scientists. They asked themselves, the stress resonance. So that I just explained, you have to be in the same room, right? So they said, okay, what happens if the observer is behind a window, a false glass or whatever? And they found that even if the observer is behind a glass, yes, you can have stress resonance. So that was the first study. Then the last one, it's not published yet. I think it's a preprint. So this PhD2 student, what she did, she said, okay, can it go through a computer? So what she did, she stressed out people in the lab and then she filmed them. And the beauty is that she was measuring stress hormones. So she knew those who had small increase in stress hormones versus those who really, reacted to the stressor. So she could have, kind of different stress magnitude. And she presented the videos to observers, who were watching the video on the computer. And she found some elements of resonance. Now, we have to be aware of this because these are, as Jaideep and Alex were saying, very, very complex studies. The results, I'm explaining the results very clearly to you. They're not that clear. There's a lot of, gray zone. I mean, we want this to be true, but we will need much more studies before being totally certain that this is something that is happening every time we see someone stressed out on the screen.
Well, it's my opportunity to go completely off topic because the same sort of thing has been done to try and answer the question, can people tell when somebody is staring at them from behind? And these experiments were done 100 years ago, first with somebody in a chair, let's say 5 meters away from the person who isn't looking at them. But then they were concerned that the negative results or positive results just meant that somebody rustled in their chair, and that meant they were turning to look. And the last set of experiments, which were ambiguous, actually had the starer in one room in a building looking into a TV camera and the monitor being in the other room with the person being stared at. And still no conclusion. Anyway, Alex, I've got a question for you. What is the best kind of physical activity and mindfulness practice for reducing stress?
Well, for physical activity, aerobic exercise is found to be most beneficial. It increases or it strengthens your cardiovasculature, so it helps you to manage, it buffers the stress response a bit, and it also shows to be very helpful in terms of what it's doing in the brain. So it increases chemicals in the brain that are important for healthy brain function, and it influences parts of the brain, such as the hippocampus, which Dr. Lupien mentioned, which is important for learning and memory, but it also plays a role in our stress-sensitive system. So aerobic training and that could just be going for a brisk walk. You don't have to go crazy and do a step class. Just go for a brisk walk. In terms of mindfulness, with mindfulness, it's the way that mindfulness is being sold is very simplistic. And so it's not just about sitting on a cushion and focusing your attention for a particular point of time. That's part of the formal practice, but it's also about cultivating certain attitudes, such as acceptance, recognizing when there's judgment that shows up, and also this normalizing of the experience, normalizing that stress is a universal experience. Suffering, which is stress, feeling discomfort, that this is universal and that it's okay and that it will pass. So, in terms of my own personal practice, it's a secular mindfulness meditation practice that also includes compassion meditation, but that's sort of it's difficult to answer that question on this platform with just a few minutes.
If I may just add something, there's a very good book, perhaps, that I know the public really like, and I don't know if, Alex, you will agree, it's by Barbara Fredrickson, Love 2.0, which is quite an interesting book on the power of compassion to, stop a stress response right there. And so what Alex is a bit talking about, I think it can be found in some of what she will write in this book.
Yeah. I mean, Fredrickson, she developed the broaden and build model, which is in the area of positive psychology. And positive psychology is really a foundation for a lot of the work that's being done in mindfulness. So the notion of compassion, through compassion training, you actually are able to broaden and build your resources, which helps you to manage stress and actually be very resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Lupien, we just heard again that you had mentioned the hippocampus, central piece of the brain for learning and short-term memory, and stress hormones impact that. does that suggest that you wouldn't learn as well or you wouldn't remember as well if you were stressed?
I've worked on this for 21 years. Alex is laughing because Alex was my student. I'm so happy to see her there as a scientist. I feel like a proud mother. So she knows I've been working on that. So for 21 years, I've studied the effects of stress on memory performance. And yes, it does decrease performance. But let me tell you the first thing it does. Before memorizing anything, you need to pay attention to this thing. So if you don't pay attention to what I'm telling you right now, you will never memorize it because you did not pay attention. So there are many, many types of attention, and the most important type of attention you need in order to memorize something is what we call selective attention. And selective attention is the capacity of your brain to discriminate between what is relevant and what is irrelevant for you. And your brain will only memorize what you find is relevant. So if you're taking notes at home, based on what I'm saying, and I was comparing your note, it would not be written the same thing on your piece of paper because you're writing what you think is relevant and you're writing what you think is relevant. If I do an exam tomorrow morning, one of you two will be in big trouble because I'm deciding what is relevant. This is important. Each time, every year in my class at university, some students come to see me after my exam and say, Professor, I don't understand. I studied and I had 60%. Why? And I say, simple. Because at the time of taking notes in the class, you were not able, I'll tell you why in a few minutes, to discriminate what is relevant from what is irrelevant. So you spend the entire week studying what was irrelevant. Now, you can think it's quite easy to do this, but it's quite difficult. And the first thing that stress does is kind of taking paint and splashing this between relevant, irrelevant, and at some point you don't know what is relevant anymore. And I've worked so many years with stressed out people that when you sit with someone who is very stressed out and you say, tell me how you feel, they will always do this. They will say, no, important, not important, left by, like they're totally unable to discriminate between what is relevant and what is irrelevant. The first sign that stress gets to your brain for me is that I was seeing this in my kids, for example, when the stress starts to, get chronic and access your brain, that's the most important thing that stress will do.
Alex, you mentioned the four sort of categories of things that reduce stress: physical activity, social life, meditation or mindfulness, and diet. There's at least one question that's come in about asking if there's any evidence that during COVID, people's diets have changed. But I'd like to broaden that and look at the four and ask, to me, social interaction would surely be inhibited by COVID. So is there any evidence building that in any of the four factors, some have been hit harder by the pandemic than others?
That's an interesting question. In terms of research, I'm not that familiar if there's anything that's been published just yet. I think that there's a lot of research going on in terms of what COVID is doing. And it's going to depend, right? We know that if someone is experiencing chronic stress and if they don't have the proper coping strategies in place, then they are likely, going to perhaps make some poor choices. But then some of it was, in the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was baking bread, right? And so how did that impact our diet? And I have done, right now, it was a qualitative study looking at older adults and the lived experience of older adults during the pandemic. And some of them talked about, the fact that they were baking bread and baking for their neighbors and everything. And then they noticed that everyone was gaining weight. So they kind of stopped doing that, right? In terms of, so there's a lot of anecdotal stuff out there. In terms of the research, I haven't read anything myself. But that being said, again, it's going to depend on the individual. Again, some people will manage the stress or feeling overwhelmed by engaging in emotional eating. So there are people that are going to do that, but there are others who won't. There are others who will make it a point to ensure that they're getting out, to remain physically active, who will set time to meet with friends and family via Zoom, to have dinner together or to have a glass of wine together. So it really is going to depend on the individual.
You're really interested in the effects of stress in older adults. Surely some of the most heartbreaking images that we've seen have been people in long-term care homes that can't actually physically interact with their families. So I understand there may not be significant research on this yet, but would you anticipate an increase in stress in people who are confined and unable to interact with their families?
Yeah, I would. Stress, increased loneliness as well. And so increased loneliness, increased depression. And I would definitely, again, planning on research. There's some research that we're planning right now, and one is an intervention research study because of the need that's being seen in these long-term care homes, and many of the residents who are showing signs of increased loneliness and low mood due to the pandemic and the restrictions around it.
I'll throw out this question to everybody. Any evidence that of the effects of pets on stress?
Oh, I've done many studies on that, and
You've done many studies on every single question I've asked.
But people call me. This is a nice story. One day, the phone rings, and there's a guy at the other end of the phone. He says, "Sonia, my name is Robert. I'm blind. I have a service dog, and I'm a scientist. And I work for this foundation who provides service dog for blind people. And I think that service dogs would be good for children who are, they have developmental disorder like autism, who are nonverbal. But I have a problem, Sonia, because since these kids don't talk, I will not know whether the dog is doing good or bad. And I want to know before I, train these dogs to give to these kids." So I said, he says, can we measure the stress hormones? So at least we will have an idea if we're doing bad. So I said, let's do this. So we've done this study in many, many children. So what he did, he measured the stress hormones 2 weeks before the introduction of the dog in the family. And then the dog was there for 4 weeks. And then they took out the dog. So it was an ABA protocol, as we call in science. And Robert, after that, died of a heart attack. So this is a detective story, because I said to myself, this guy tested about 70 families and we have no idea about the results. So we were able to find his wife, get the computer, get the data. We analyzed the results and published the paper with him as first author, just as a tribute to all the work that he did. And it was the most significant decrease of stress hormones I ever saw in my life. I mean, before the introduction of the dog in the family, the stress hormones were high. And then when the dog is there during the 4 weeks, because he was measuring it every week, and then when the dog was out, it increased. So with the results, I went to see the president of the foundation. I said, that's not very nice, because we now know when the kids don't have the dog. So they gave back the dog. It's $10,000 per dog to the families. And today, they are giving service dog, but not after a second study, because when I was talking to them, I said, okay, fine, but if it's the parents that are very stressed out by the dog because they have to take care of a dog plus a child with autism, you have to do a study where you will make sure that it doesn't have a stressful effect for the parents as well. So they did this last study, and now based on this. So there are many, many studies. The first study that was done actually on the effects of pet was done by a veterinarian, that's difficult for my French, who was more concerned about the dog. So he wanted to know whether the stress hormone of the dog was decreasing when someone was petting the dog, and it does. And then the psychologists came in, they said, no, we're interested in the guy petting the dog. They started to study the person who was taking care of the dog, and it's a significant decrease as well. But there's a trick. You need to love dogs, because if you don't, it won't have any significant effect for sure. So there are quite a lot of studies now out there, and I'm collaborating on a very nice study now. They're using these service dogs to help children from youth services, for example, who have to go and be witness for their parents, in court. This is not fun for the children, and sometimes it can be quite a traumatic experience. So they're using these service dogs in order to help the child deal with the stress response, and we're studying the effects. So many, many studies now. And I don't know if it can be translated, because that's always the question, to rabbits and cats, and we don't know. It's the dog is quite a popular participant in the studies, but we don't know if you see this with other pets so far.
Well, having to be a dog lover kind of rules out Jaideep doing this experiment with stressed mice.
Yeah.
And Jaideep, I have a question for you. It's on the human side of this, but do you think different levels of empathy can affect how one person catches another person's state like stress?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, one, there's always kind of individual variability in any experiment you do from mice up to humans. I think when we think about empathy and what empathy is and different levels of it, what we're actually talking about, if we can make it a little bit more scientific, is that different people have different levels of sensitivity to others' emotional states. And so if you have a different level of sensitivity, that may mean you choose to interact more or less with somebody who is stressed. And so then I would say that yes, your chance of transferring or receiving stress from others may in fact be determined by how much empathy you exhibit or how empathetic you are and how much you interact with that person. So I don't have any data to support this idea. Maybe Sonia does, but yeah, it's really a great question.
But in human, yeah. So go, Alex.
Oh no, go ahead, Sonia.
I just wanted to say, in human research, it's easy to do, but in animal as well, as Jaideep was saying, it's easy to do present or absent. But different level of severity of a stressor or different level of empathy is extremely difficult to it's very difficult to study this way. This is why you don't see a lot of results on that.
It's also important to differentiate between empathy and compassion. So there's quite a bit of research in the area of positive psychology looking at the difference between the two. So with empathy, you put yourself in that person's shoes and you could actually feel the distress that that person is sensing, and that could actually be harmful for the individual. It's also associated with activation of parts of the brain that are associated with the brain center, with the pain centers of the brain. Whereas with compassion, it's sort of, you're able you're able to be present with what that person's experiencing, but it's also their pain. It's not your pain. And so in that case, persons who display high levels of compassion in the context, this is associated with different circuits of brain activity. So circuits that are associated with motivation, so dopaminergic, dopamine systems in the brain. So, if you think about caregiver, this is in the area of caregivers. So if you think about caregivers and this notion of compassion exhaustion, it really is this empathy exhaustion that caregivers are experiencing, where it's not just about being able to empathize with the person, but it's also being able to recognize that it is their pain and you could be there for them. And by not internalizing that person's pain or stress, then you can actually help them through the process.
Which just underlines just how challenging and difficult being a caregiver is. We have a few minutes left, and I would like, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask each of you to maybe describe one study that you're embarking on or that you're in the middle of, not asking for results, but just to give our audience a sense of where or what some of the directions stress research is heading. Can we do that, Jaideep?
Sure. So so I'll just talk about two things very quickly. One of them, both of them extend from this transmission of stress idea. One of them is really thinking about this concept that is emerging that social interactions, that there's a pressure to interact socially, just like there's a pressure to make sure we control our level of body fluids. So it's a kind of a homeostatic function. That's what social interactions are. And so we're starting to do some experiments to see if we can shift social pressures a little bit, really motivated by what we're seeing a lot in COVID with loneliness and social isolation, and thinking about whether that will change social pressure, make individuals want to interact more socially or less socially. Will it change their ability to discriminate signals associated with stress? Will it make those sharper? Will it make those duller? Will that how will that affect their behavior? I think that's really an interesting question. The second one that we're thinking a lot about, and we've touched on this, we talked about how stress affects memory, learning and memory. And so we're thinking about how transmitted stress affects learning and memory. So if you pick up the stress of somebody else, is it going to affect your ability to recall critical information? And what are the areas of the brain that, one, detect that signal and then interfere with your ability to remember things?
Nice. Alex?
Well, one study that I have not started yet, but this is something I hope to start in the fall, is a mindfulness for caregiver study. So sort of extending on the work that I've already done, looking at the benefits of a mindfulness workshop for caregivers of persons with dementia, looking at the impact on cognitive health, psychosocial well-being, the impact that it may have on the care recipient as well. So how effective is there an increase in effectiveness in terms of being a caregiver in that context, but also looking at some of the underlying biological changes that may happen, in particular looking at inflammation in the body.
Sounds complex to me. Sonia?
Well, two studies. The first one is on stress mindset. So I alluded to that earlier. So stress mindset is the definition you have of stress. So you can have negative stress mindset and think all the time that, stress is bad, toxic, you're going to die from it. Or you can have a positive stress mindset. It was a very well-known comedian told me, like, the only time where I didn't have the track before, the stress before a presentation, I was very bad. So exactly that. So, and in one of the studies by a woman named Crum, what she did, she brought people in the lab. Some people had negative stress mindset and some people had positive stress mindset. And she measured the stress hormones of these two groups and found that those people who had negative stress mindset produced more stress hormones than those who had. So the way you see stress will determine if you produce stress hormones a lot or not. Now, after that, she took people who had negative stress mindset, and for a week, she showed them videos with the positive effects of stress. And she was able to decrease the stress hormones in these people. And then she took people who had positive stress mindset, and for a week, she showed them videos of the negative effects of stress, and she was able to increase stress. So in these times of COVID, if you look at all the headlines, kids will die. I mean, you have 97% of children who are going to be this is too high. And by doing these types of things, we are putting negative stress mindset. So what I'm doing with all of my students, we're trying to counteract this and teach children with, videos, etc., that they are totally able to deal with this stress, or the human body has been created to deal with it. We would not have survived to the mammoth if it was not the case. Yes, we're going to have side effects, we're going to have headaches and everything, but we are okay with this. So to see whether we can decrease it. And the videos we are doing so far are extremely popular with the children because they're very avid about that. So that's the first type of study. The second type, which is very interesting to me, is a methodological research. In research, it's called the selection bias. And Alex, I'm sure you're going to be interested in that. When we do research, I'm a stress scientist. I do research. I will put an ad on Facebook or in the newspaper, and I'm going to say, are you stressed out? Or a study on stress and memory. And Jaideep doesn't have this problem because he's working with animals, but with humans, we have what is called selection bias. Now, who are the people answering my ads? Can I really generalize my result to the entire population? So those who answer my ads, are they those who are very stressed out, who are trying to find cure for themselves? Or are they the Zen people? Or are they just, random people? And I think when we're going to know about this or organizing stuff, we need as scientists to have this critical point of view. And this is, the capacity of science to auto-correct itself, as we call it. Because we need to make sure that the conclusion that we get from our studies can be generalized to all of you. If not, then we're going to have to change the way we recruit people. I have no idea how, but we're going to have to do that. So that's the things that keep me busy these days, Jay.
All three are really fascinating, and we will all wait with curiosity to see how those turn out. I just have to thank you all very much for this. This has really been a great, great panel. Alex, Sonia, and Jaideep, really appreciate you taking the time to educate us all about stress, how to deal with it, what it is, and again, to talk about your future work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you for inviting us.